behalf of Harvard's Center for Computation on Research for Computation and Society and the Institute for Applied Computational Science, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a multifaceted look at the VW incident. I will confess up front, we've had an ongoing debate among the panelists whether we should call this the VW incident or the VW scandal. We'll leave that to an audience vote at the end of this show. So the way this is going to work is I will briefly introduce all our panelists so you know who we have here. I'll open with a very short introduction about what actually happened, who knew what when, or what do we know about that. And then each of the panelists will speak for about 5 or 7 minutes. At that point, we will go to a discussion among the panelists. And as soon as you can no longer contain yourselves, we'll open it up to questions and answers from the crowd. So that's the agenda. My name is Margot Seltzer. I'll be your moderator for this evening. So our panelists for this evening, in no particular order, we have David Keith. He has worked near the interface between climate science, energy technology, and public policy for 25 years. He took first prize in Canada's National Physics Prize exam, won MIT's prize for excellence in experimental physics, and was one of Time magazine's Heroes of the Environment. Best known for his work on solar geoengineering, David's analytical work has ranged from the climatic impacts of large-scale wind power to an early critique of the prospects for hydrogen fuel. David has built a high-accuracy infrared spectrometer for NASA ER2, developed new methods for reservoir engineering, increased the safety of stored CO2. He's the professor of applied physics in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and the professor of public policy in the Harvard Kennedy School. He spends about a third of his time in Calgary, where he helps lead Carbon Engineering, a company developing technology to capture CO2 from ambient air. Next, we have Professor Chang. He is a professor of mechanical engineering and director of the Sloan Automotive Laboratory at MIT. He received his BS in engineering science from Caltech in 1974 and a PhD in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT in 1978. He was on the technical staff at Aerodyne Research, Inc. from 78 to 80, and then he joined the MIT Mechanical Engineering Department as an assistant professor. His research interests include internal combustion engine technologies and transportative energy usage issues. He is a fellow of the Society of Automotive Engineers. On the far end, we have Jonathan Zittrain. He is the George Bemis Professor of International Law at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's also a professor of computer science at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, as well as vice dean for library and information resources for the Harvard Law School Library. And if that isn't enough titles, he is also the faculty director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. Have we missed any?
No, the dental school appointment is still in process.
Thank you. And Divinity School is coming any day now. His research interests include battles for control of digital property and content, cryptography, electronic privacy, the roles of intermediaries within Internet architecture, human computing, and the useful and unobtrusive development of technology in education. He is a member of the board of directors of the EFF. He has served as a trustee of the Internet Society and as a Forum Fellow of the World Economic Forum, which named him a young global leader. He was a distinguished scholar in residence at the Federal Communications Commission and previously chaired the FCC's Open Internet Advisory Committee. His book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, predicted the end of general-purpose client computing and the corresponding rise of new gatekeepers. And last, but far from least, we have Lynn Sharp-Payne, who is the John G. McLean Professor and Senior Associate Dean at Harvard Business School. She is a member and former chair of the General Management Unit. She co-founded the school's required course on leadership and corporate accountability. She currently teaches boards of directors and corporate governance in the elective curriculum and making corporate boards more effective in the executive program. Dr. Payne's research focuses on the leadership and governance of companies that meld high ethical standards with outstanding financial results. Her most recent book is Capitalism at Risk, Rethinking the Role of Business, with HBS colleagues Joe Bauer and Dutch Leonard. Her recent articles include Sustainability in the Boardroom, The China Rules, and A Global Leader's Guide to Managing Business Conduct, all in Harvard Business Review. She's a director of the ATOS SE New York Stock Exchange Euronext Paris, and serves on the governing board of the Center for Audit Quality. She was a director of Risk Metrics Group until June 2010, when it became part of MSCI. A graduate of Smith College, she holds a doctorate in moral philosophy from Oxford University and a law degree from the Harvard Law School. So please join me in welcoming our panelists for this evening. Before I turn it over to them, I just want to give you a brief rundown of sort of what happened. It actually starts in 1950, but I promise it'll still be brief. So 1950 is when a researcher in California discovered that automobiles contribute to air pollution. And over the next 20 years, this led to the establishment of the Clean Air Act in 1970. At that time, automobiles were emitting on the order of 3.6 grams of nitrogen oxides per mile driven, which turns out to be a really big number of something that's really bad for you. So the Clean Air Act said that over the next 5 years, that needed to be reduced by 90%. The auto manufacturers didn't quite make the deadline, and they got sort of a bye until 1977, when the limit was reduced to 1 milligram per mile. Fast forward over the next 20 years, and these limits have kept going down. So today, we are in what's called Tier 2, which is part of the current clean air legislation. And the way this works is that auto manufacturers take each of their cars, and they put them in different bins depending on how emissions efficient they are. And the overall fleet of all the cars has to come in below this limit of 0.07 milligrams per mile. So you have your really high-end cars. Those can discharge a little more. You have your really efficient ones. They do a little less. And overall, you have to be on average. So in 2014, a group at the West Virginia University decided to look at the emissions of cars as they were driving. Because the current practice is that you put the cars on this thing called a dynamometer, which you could think of as a treadmill for cars. And when it's on the treadmill, the front wheels spin, but the back wheels don't. And that's how the emissions are measured. And so all these cars were passing all their tests. Well, these automotive engineers started testing them on roads. And they had 5 different kinds of drives, up and down hills, rural, in the city. And what they discovered was that several of the cars they tested had emissions that were on the order of 10 to 40 times this limit. So that seemed odd. And in the spirit of good scholarship, they started pointing fingers at each other for getting the measurements wrong. And finally, they discovered that, in fact, the measurements were right, and there was something going on with the cars. So as early as 2014, there was some question about a few models of Volkswagens. At the end of 2014, VW says, oh, no, it's fine. Here's a software fix. Everything's good. The EPA continues its investigation. And in about the middle of 2015, it turns out that there is this mechanism called a defeat device, which is a piece of software that detects when the car is being tested. And that's sort of normal. Most cars have that because when they're being tested, you don't want them to think that they're in danger and start triggering all sorts of unusual reaction. But the way this worked was that this actually changed how the engine operated, brought the emissions down below the limits during the test, and then as soon as the car was off the dynamometer and driving on the roads, all bets were off, and it started emitting at 10 to 40 times the rate. Within about a week of the scandal breaking, the president of Volkswagen had stepped down, and the situation is currently being discussed in various countries around the world. VW has recently informed the public that they can't quite get the fix out in time that they were told they had to. And so we thought this was a fabulous opportunity for a teachable moment about how something like this could happen. So on that note, I would like to turn it over to Professor Chang, who will lead us off.
All right. Let me just say a few words about the whole situation. Actually, Volkswagen is not the first guy who cheats. And there are several cases of cheating in the past, and I guess that those cases, they were caught early, and so they pay a fine. It's not a small fine, but they just pay it and sort of get over with it and get on with the business. The Volkswagen case is sort of strange in several senses. Number one is that it's not really financial. I was actually quite amazed to learn that, well, some of it is financial, but a lot of it is really not financial in the sense that some of the cars actually were equipped with the full emission control equipment. So it's only the software that they put in that basically do the cheating. And so essentially, they cheat is so that the car is more fun to drive. And so what I would like to do is to look back and try to understand why this happened, because if you just say that it's all the bad guys who do all the cheating and sort of put them all to jail, the world will be a better world. But that's sort of like the Donald Trump approach. The world actually would not become a better world because there will be other people who cheat. And so what I want to do is try to understand the circumstances and what do the engineers think when they do this. It's not just a few people. It's a fairly sizable sort of, well, the whole what they call engine calibration is a fairly sizable enterprise with many people in there. So it's difficult to get everybody to sort of line up and do this thing. So that's something that we would like to look at, and I guess I will try to focus in that area.
So maybe I'll start with a really basic trade-off. Like lots of things in life, you can't get it all. And for cars and trains and planes and basically any internal engine, there's a harsh trade-off. If you want to make the engine more efficient, you burn it at higher pressure and temperature, and that also means it makes more nitrogen oxides. So that trade-off is ubiquitous. There's no way out. And that means there's a trade-off between what we care about for climate, which is basically the fuel efficiency of the vehicle, and what we care about for air pollution, which is the NOx. There's a sharp trade-off between the two. If you just ask people to be more efficient and they didn't care about NOx, all vehicles would get several percent more efficient. So this was VW's attempt. You got to see this in the picture of VW trying to meet multiple objectives. One objective being to make cars that are more fuel efficient, means less gas for a given length, given distance driven, and therefore also less CO2 emissions. And the other thing to have less emissions of NOx and some other gases, but NOx is the hard one. So that trade-off is real, and all the automakers are kind of like a limbo artist just barely getting under the wire. So it's just a fact that these particular dynamometer drive cycles, so that the car is driven on a fake cycle, that people optimize the vehicles to just barely get under the cycle. And they don't necessarily actually perform quite so well in the real world. That's kind of a fact that we're pushing up against the edge of the engineering. What we did was do a little study on the direct health impacts. And to give you the sort of punchline of the study, we used a model that estimates how much extra ozone this NOx ends up making and how much extra particulate matter it makes. And maybe to give you a little bit of calibration, it's important to say that cars now kill something like 50,000 people a year in North America from air pollution, more than they kill by collisions. And part of the reason we did this study, which was kind of fun because we produced a peer-reviewed paper from talking about it to all done in 2 weeks, was to illustrate that with modern models with some very clever little numerical tricks, we can accurately estimate the marginal impact of pretty small excess NOx emissions in a kind of spatially disaggregated way. So we even played around with whether we could look at the inequalities from these impacts, thinking of which people buy these more expensive vehicles and who suffers and so on. Very rough punchline, we estimate that just in the 2008 to 2015 timeframe, this would have caused excess mortality of about 60 people, but there's big error bars, 10 to 150 in our study. And if they did do the repair, that would save about 180 lives. And that's just North American numbers with pretty reasonable propagation of uncertainty. So part of the point here is to get a sense that these air pollution numbers are real, Although, caveat, there are deep uncertainties about what component of the particulate matter is actually killing people. So the uncertainties in some ways, the systematic ones, are bigger than the uncertainties we directly claim. But I think the important parts from my point of view are that these trade-offs are ubiquitous, and that by pushing the car manufacturers to do that, as we need to do for public health, we're pushing them into places where they have small range of options, particularly in their choice between diesel engines and other vehicles. I think maybe one last thing to say is regulating for, say, sulfur, which is an element, is fundamentally easier, because if you stop the sulfur going into the fuel supply chain, then you know it won't be coming out of the tailpipes because it's an element, it's conserved. But NOx is made in the vehicles, so there's no such easy way to know exactly how much vehicle NOx is emitted.
You know, let me use this microphone if that's okay. So thank you, Margot, for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. I knew that I would learn a lot from doing this, and I'm already learning a lot right now as we go along. But as Margot said, I work in the area of corporate governance and leadership. And for the last 3.5 decades or so, I've been looking at corporate ethics and business ethics in general. And so I thought it might be helpful if I put the VW situation in a little bit of a context of what's been going on over the past 3.5 decades in this area. And so what I did to prepare for this panel was to sit down and look back and make a list of the cases of companies that I've explored over the last 30 years plus, and examine what exactly, do we see any patterns, do we see any trends? And I put together a list of something like 20-plus cases. I would stress this is not meant to be a complete list. This is just a list of the ones that I happen to know something about. And when this goes all the way back to the early 80s. I'm sure that you all don't remember, but back in the early 80s, we had a very serious crisis scandal at Johns Manville, which involved asbestos safety, and the company had to declare bankruptcy because of all of the wrongful death and illness claims that were made against the company that were related to asbestos, which was its principal product at the time. But this list goes all the way through the 80s, the 90s, Enron and all of that in early 2000s, the Siemens bribery scandal, the BP oil spill, the subprime mortgage crisis, the GM ignition switch issue, and now we're up to VW. So now if we look back, I thought, gee, this is a pretty interesting list. Industries that were covered, almost all industries. There was consumer goods, financial services, healthcare, manufacturing, extractive and energy. Automotive shows up several times. The ethical issues were very varied. We had consumer fraud, securities fraud, product safety, workplace safety, environmental issues, human rights, labor issues, all over the place. But what was quite also very interesting was to see the evolution of these types of corporate misconduct breakdowns or corporate responsibility breakdowns. The earlier ones tended to focus pretty much on the US. And as you look over the years, by the mid-90s, the impact was being felt globally, not just in the US. And certainly with Enron, almost anywhere, I happened to be traveling a lot right after Enron, almost anywhere I went in the world, I met somebody who'd been hurt by Enron, including in Africa. I remember talking to an accountant who lost his job because Arthur Andersen collapsed along with Enron at the time. But the impact and the scale and complexity have increased enormously. The cost to the companies have increased enormously as well. If you go back and look at the earlier cases, I remember the Treasury auction bidding crisis at Salomon Brothers in the early 90s. Everyone was talking about, wasn't it shocking, that was $1 billion error of judgment. 1 billion. By the late 90s, we had the $2 billion healthcare fraud at HCA Columbia. By early 2000s, we had the Bridgestone Firestone tire recall, which was a $4 billion crisis. And now I hear that the VW crisis, the total cost is somewhere between, people have estimated, nobody really knows, but between $30 and $50 billion. So incredible to see how that's changed. But if I step back, and this is the point I really want to make, and it comes back to Professor Chang's question. When I look at all of these cases and peel back the differences and the complexities and try to understand what was really going on at the decision-making level among the people who made the basic decision around which all of these derivative cover-ups and all of those decisions were made, I see in many cases a very similar pattern. And to explain this pattern, I think it's probably best if I just share a few quotes with you. And the first one is a Bridgestone Firestone executive who's reflecting on the data that he received. And he received this data long before the crisis erupted. But this was data on the rising rate of defective tires that the company was producing. And here's what he said when he was asked about this. He said, quote, "I'm sorry to say that I looked at it from a financial point of view, but not a customer safety point of view." Here's a second one. This is a lawyer reflecting on Enron's accounting. Quote, "The company's accounting methods were not inappropriate from a technical point of view." Here's one from the head of risk management at a major bank reflecting on the subprime mortgage crisis. Quote, "There was no sign that ethical considerations played any part in the deliberations about subprime mortgages." Here's one more. This is a manager involved in the bribery scandal at Siemens. "I was not responsible for the bribery. I organized the cash. I didn't really look at it from an ethical standpoint." So you think about all those decisions. These were people who were very immediately involved. This question of what is the standpoint, what is the point of view, what is the perspective you bring to your decision making is very central. And what's striking about all of these cases is that in none of them did anybody even bring an ethical point of view to the decision making. So what you see is not so much the presence of some kind of malevolent intent as the absence of any concern about the impact of the decision on third parties, about the ethical considerations involved. So this is not the pattern in every single case, but it's a pattern I've seen often enough that it makes me wonder if this is what happened at VW. And obviously, we don't really know very much about what happened, what the engineers were really thinking at the time they made the decision. But what we do know is actually quite consistent with that explanation in that we were told in December by the supervisory board that it was not possible for the engineers to meet the stricter emission standards in California in a way that was legal and also within their budget and the time frame. And we also know, as Dr. Chang pointed out, that there had been previous cases in which there was defeat devices were used and the EPA had brought actions, but these were all rather small fines and they were civil actions. And if you looked at this purely from a financial point of view, it would have made sense. We don't have any evidence that anybody asked questions like, what is the health impact? Or what is the impact on the environment? Or even, what is the impact on our consumers? What are our responsibilities to our consumers? Will this breach the relationship of trust we need to have? Those questions, apparently, we don't have any evidence. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the report tells us when it comes out in late April. There's many investigations going on, and we will learn more. So let me just wrap up this little introduction by saying, for me, given where I sit, what this case raises is the question is how can leaders of organizations, especially businesses, ensure or try at least to promote good judgment in their organizations. And by good judgment, judgment that includes these ethical considerations that seem to be omitted in so many cases. And I do think that more business leaders are beginning to appreciate that it's not enough simply to put out a code of conduct, which, of course, VW had done. And it's not enough to start a compliance program, which VW had done, although some people say it wasn't a very good compliance program, and we could talk about that if that's of interest. But the question is, if you really want people to think about these things, to integrate this kind of thinking into their decision-making, it needs to be worked into the fabric of the decision frameworks that you use. It has to be part of the conversation in the organization. People have to feel comfortable saying, we've got a problem here, we need to figure out how to solve it. And that's a way of talking and thinking that doesn't come naturally to some people, we've found. And I think this comes back to us as educators. If we in our respective schools are helping people to develop the competencies to look at decisions from all of these different angles, I think that's a crucial part of what we should be trying to do, and that's another topic we might want to take up here. The last point I'd like to make, though, as long as we're having this discussion, I hope that we will stay grounded in some kind of reality, because I do feel that as human beings, we're kind of pathetic when it comes to some of these ethical issues. I mean, given the choice between keeping your job, getting the bonus, having people like you, or dealing with a nasty ethical issue that's going to cost you those things, I think a very large proportion of us would choose the job, the bonus, and the friends.
So in thinking about tonight, I've wanted to try to ground myself in just how bad VW's behavior is. And I would like some help with that. So I'm asking those in the room, there's no way to pull those on the stream, but I include my co-panelists in this. If you would describe from Professor Seltzer's description what VW did and what followed from it as essentially no big deal, raise your hand. I realize we are a self-selected group who chose to attend a panel on the scandal, so this is, of course, not a scientific survey. Nobody wants to say this is no big deal. Okay, if you want to describe this as like, they screwed up, you know, we don't want to hang them out to dry. They screwed up, something should happen, but kind of on a scale of 1 to 10, this is basically a 3 or a 4. Let me know. Okay, a couple sympathetic folks here. If this is like not normal, this should not be happening, this needs to be stopped, this is like bad stuff, we should stop what we're doing until we figure out what's going on, as one of our presidential candidates says. Probably am tainting the question by including that reference. But if you think this is roughly like a 6 or a 7, raise your hand. Okay, lots of 6s and 7s.
How far does the scale go?
10.
Okay.
I'm not planning to filibuster my time with just going up to 100 here. So yes, denominator is 10. And in fact, this is now the last question. If this is like, we have finally caught the Ouroboros, the giant vampire squid of evil that corporate entity is capable of, and we've like got the specimen pinned down in the bowl, and we really need to do something serious about it. All right, that's a pretty good description of 9 or 10. How many people say we're at that level? Okay. All right, so we're, it's like just a couple. So we're all in the kind of 7 or 8 level. I want to try on the case as to why we're even bigger than a 6 or a 7, but I do it with humility. And I don't know why that occasions a lot of laughter. I'm seriously humble about this. When you think about criminal behavior and trying to minimize it, there are gradations, misdemeanors, felonies, etc. And here, the harm, as David was explaining, is quite inchoate. This isn't belching literal poison into the air. It's stuff that is bad, but really hard to measure how bad. And among the things we encounter in our water, in our air from noxious emissions, from power plants and such, I'm gathering that this is not great, but it's probably not that terrible either. David's thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hard part is we all sorts of processes contribute. So it's very
Yes.
hard to associate your emissions
Yes.
with this impact. But collectively, all those toxic emissions, say in a polluted city,
Yes.
take years off people's lives.
I hear
No
that.
joke.
But this is a burdened camel's back for which this is a straw, and there are many other straws like it, but it is but a straw. It's not a 10-ton anvil. Okay.
Let me check a little bit.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Should the engine be invented?
Should the
Engine be invented in the first place?
Should the engine have been invented in the first place, it would be a more aggressive Clean Air Act to say that
I
you
mean,
must...
should we always go by the horse?
Yes, which has its own emissions problems, to be sure, and environmental issues, but maybe we should just be walking or plugged into virtual reality and mining Bitcoin, which has its own emissions problems. You can see how once you get into this game, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, except in as much as we're trying to universalize behavior to eliminate all the straws on the back, so we should treat this straw very seriously once we've caught it. But to me, so that's one possible harm. Another harm is, did it wrong the drivers of the vehicles? And I think this is an interesting question, because there are some drivers, the journalists went out and I think had to work a long day to find them, who were like, I specifically bought this diesel bug because it was certified under the Clean Air Act as, like every other car, conforming. And to find out that it wasn't makes me feel betrayed, because I'm adding straws to camels' backs. I think maybe there are people ready to say they were injured that way. But interestingly, and I think, Lynn, you were getting at this, part of what VW was doing was generating, and this was your word for it, fun cars. You know, it's like fun that you used to have before we worried about clean air. And that's in service to the customer. You take a test drive and you're like, it's so peppy. It gets such great gas mileage. What's not to like? So figuring out if there's really harm to the consumer, I think the closest thing for harm to the consumer is that the value of the car has now been significantly impaired because they were caught. And the car is now sort of probably going to have to be fixed. The problem is we're going to have to fix it to the consumer rather than that it is broken, if that makes sense. But I think there's a larger harm at work. And this gets at the really decades-long tussle of the proper role and locus of where limits should be set and the role of government in setting them, which is to say, for once, we have a rule rather than a standard. It's not just like be kind or, you know, don't screw over your customers or the sorts of things that the Federal Trade Commission in America and its counterparts around the world try to do under the rubric of don't engage in unfair or deceptive trade practices. This is much more, look, we have tried to figure out how many straws the camel's back can bear, and this is the limit we have set. And we're trusting you, now that especially that engines can be controlled in such an exquisitely detailed way, thanks to the digitization of what is otherwise a mechanical combustion process, you certify to us that this is how the engine will behave. And in fact, if something goes awry in a given engine, the auxiliary emissions control device is supposed to know that there's something wrong with the engine and put on a little light that says, you're a bad person unless you take this into the shop and have it fixed. I think that's what the service light, that's what I take it to mean. And in so brazenly not abiding by that bargain, not only not tuning the engine to meet the certification and certifying it that way nonetheless, but having the actual engine be, quote, smart enough to charm a test designed to elicit exactly the answer to the question of whether the engine is conforming, that strikes me as a very sharp point of a dagger pointed at the heart of the rule of law. If we only treat this as a question of how much bad emissions got out as a result of this. If we find out, it turns out that NOxes aren't that bad, NOxen aren't that bad, I think that should be irrelevant. The fact is, we've set a standard by a country that embraces, more or less, the rule of law, and we do it for reasons that balance a lot of things. For a company or any constituent part enough to be able to make this happen across 500,000 cars in North America, to flout it is something that has to be treated with the spirit of criminality, if not literally criminal rules. This is not just, you've messed up, you should compensate to outweigh the harm you've done. You have to go over and above to express the proper role of regulation and establishing what the boundaries will be. Because, in my view, if you do not, the message it sends to everyone else is, see what you can get away with. We don't do this with parking tickets. If you'd actually prefer to spend $25 for your parking space tonight, just don't feed the meter. It's fine. You'll get a ticket and then you'll pay it. But this isn't that. And as far as what we should do then going forward, how to do a fine commensurate with the problem is a good question. The EPA could charge under the Clean Air Act up to $37,500. How's that for a nice round number per vehicle for the violation? I think across 500,000 vehicles, it's basically about $18 billion at the max. What's the right amount? How do we pick the right amount? Whatever it should be, do we take into account that the net profit of VW in 2014 was 2.5 billion euros? Like, is that material? I suppose it is, unless you want to put them out of business. I would think actually what we should do is say, you know what, VW, we are going to fine you a hell of a lot, maybe even more than a single year's income, but you can pay on the installment plan. You can be around for years to come once you've cleaned up your act, but let this be a reminder for the next decade of what you did, and for other companies and their constituents thinking about it. That helps to solve the incentive problem that Professor Payne was talking about, which was if you're the employee and it's your job versus the ethical thing, to be able to help out the company by saying, wait a minute, if we do this, look what it could do to the company. Now you're on the company's side, potentially, by whistleblowing and helping the companies actually see that. Another approach to that could be taking a page out of the book of Sarbanes-Oxley, something that in the wake of Enron's and such says, we ask the leadership of the company to put their signature to a document that says, roughly, no financial shenanigans to see here, folks. And when a CEO has to sign that, he or she now wants to actually know if criminal or huge civil liability personally rests should they sign and be wrong. That starts to get the incentives right at the top, irrespective of what the particular culture is at a company. I think compensating the poisoned people is probably too difficult. We should just say that reestablishing the rule of law is enough, and maybe setting up whistleblower procedures so that if you blow the whistle, you can maybe even take part of. We do this in quitam things when you find government waste, fraud, and abuse. You can collect treble damages as the whistleblower for what you discovered going wrong. And ideally, what we learn about what happened at VW should be made absolutely public. These should not be under seal. These should not be obscure. It needs to be studyable. And in fact, I would say back to black boxes like the auxiliary emissions control devices, the way these things work should actually be published open source. The students of the folks here ought to be able to study that stuff and see if they can find cheating in the code. And if the code mismatches the code in the box, that alone could be cause for huge penalties. If we can get this right here, where there's been such a clear crossing of the line, my thought is that we can get right the many other ways in which increasingly, whether physical or simply embedded in software, they're black box algorithms that are making decisions, affecting things really hard to interrogate from the outside, that may be making decisions that accidentally, or in this case, intentionally cross lines of the worst sort. As we become so reliant on these algorithms, it cannot be business as usual the way that we experience and vet them. Thank you.
Okay, before I open to some more questions, do you want to respond to that?
Well, okay. Now, the way I look at it is that now I sort of feel like defending Donald Trump's follower. It actually has an
I just want to remind you, we
here.
are live streaming.
No, it's because what happened is that you just say that those are bad guys. Is it on?
Oh, yeah.
Those are bad guys. So if that's the case, then you just sort of, okay, send them all to jail and that's it. But really, that's not the case. It is that we have to understand why do they behave that way? Why do they essentially have such a world wheel, all right? So in order to make sure that it doesn't happen again, we have to understand the culture. We have to understand why do people think one way or the other. Now, to give you some background, if you look at the engine, the Japanese have the way to basically get the fund drive and fuel economy together, and they basically introduced the hybrid. The European essentially think that the diesel is their baby. The Americans, there's the turbocharged downsizing and all that stuff. So there are different technologies representing the different pride of the engineers of the different continents. You can look at it that way. So there's a certain amount of pride involved in that. Then what happened is that, now, clearly the law is violated here. Now, but then I'm trying to get the extreme example. Say, 200 years ago, I owned slaves, and you are the good guy, you are the neighbor, and you help the slaves to escape from me. Well, from my point of view, you're violating the law. Morally, you're stealing my properties. I pay good money for the slave. So are you morally right or wrong? So really, there are two things in here. One is to develop the right culture, and the other thing is that are there something which is intrinsically right or wrong that people have to develop? So, get that back to
Okay, so one can imagine two ways that this happened. So far, we don't know how this happened. But you can imagine this was a top-down directive, right? We are going to make sure that our cars pass, and they're fun to drive, and you're going to do what you need to do to make that happen. You could also imagine a more bottom-up approach, right, where the engineers said, we got a deadline coming, and we can't do this. What are we going to do? So without the advantage of actually knowing what happened, what do you all think happened?
My guess, and I'm no expert on the culture there, is that it was a pretty high-level decision, very close to the top. And the reason is that VW was pushing very hard to be largest by volume, and this issue about them particularly pushing turbo diesels as their pathway through, and the fact that in general, while we often think of Europeans as somehow having better environmental policy, for air pollution it's mostly been the other way around. The leader has mostly been the US, not perfectly, but largely. And it was very hard for them to get conformity for those vehicles into the US market. And they pushed hard to do it, and I think it was such an important part of their large-scale business strategy that it's very hard for me to imagine this was just one engineer in the middle.
I've been thinking about this one a lot, and I don't know how many layers there are in this organization. But my guess, this is a guess, we'll all find out, is that it's somewhere in the middle. Yeah. That it's not going to be your top management board, certainly not going to be the supervisory board. They will have looked at data about sales, and VW actually met its goal of doubling sales in the U.S. 3 years early. But if you also look at this from a global perspective and you think about this engine being developed in Europe, going out into 19 or 20 countries, the U.S., while it's strategically important, is not actually a very big market compared to other countries. also think about the fact that, yes, these defeat devices are now are under U.S. Clean Air Act explicitly prohibited. As far as I can make out, they were not prohibited in Europe until 2007. And that it was very widely understood that there's a discrepancy between the test results in the bay and the test results on the road. People understood that and kind of calibrated for that in their own thinking. So as I think about what was in the minds of those actual people sitting there with a European engine trying to say we're going to suit it to all of these different markets, we've got an environment where, and in the U.S., I mean, this parking ticket thing is something I had been thinking about myself. Why do you look at this as a price you pay, or do you look at it as an ethical imperative that this is what the laws are? I could easily see how people looking at the U.S. would say, well, the EPA must not think this is very important. They haven't been imposing very big fines. They haven't taken much action, so maybe this is just like a parking ticket. So putting all of that together, I bring it down to sort of a middle level. I don't think it was one engineer by any means, but the powertrain division, perhaps, maybe another level up. There would have been discussions, because this is a resource allocation decision, strategic decision. It's got a lot of implications, but it's not top-level management, I don't think.
But I think the top level people know about it, though. I think they do know about it because it's pretty bizarre that they would not know about these things.
They might have used different words. I want to pick up on defeat device. So the old law for defeat device imagined a separate, partly digital but mostly analog little widget. But nowadays, we're just talking about the engine control map. And there is no special defeat device. And in a sense, all automakers, as I said, were trying to limbo under the wire of the particular test. But these guys went much further and deliberately figured out how to cheat the test. And no doubt there's other people doing the same thing, or I think likely doing the same thing. And those tests are a very big deal because all of our health depend on them. And I want to come back to something Jonathan meant. I do think it matters that it was done in such a deliberate way. But I think there are some laws that we make clear laws for, but we all understand are maybe a little bureaucratic and not so important. It is important to say we throw around these numbers about safety. There is no other thing other than air pollution that has such big public health consequences that's an externality like that isn't to do with something you personally take or how much food you eat. Air pollution is the big tamale. And regulation of vehicle air pollution is huge and drives the economies in major ways. This is not a small thing.
Yes.
It's a major thing.
So this is not a mattress tag regulation.
Exactly.
That's the
Yeah.
classic one of, mine are still on, just for the record. But, Lynn, I'm intrigued by something you said, which was there may have been a parole outside understanding between the regulator and the regulated in Europe that it's okay to flunk the test or to pass the test if the test requires a number be 5 or below, to have your test mechanism print 5 rather than reporting whatever the state the 5 represents. I'd be so curious to know why that would be. Is it because of some treaty, but the regulators themselves don't like the treaty, so they're going easy on violations of the test? It does suggest, if it is true, as to why you could get a company so flagrantly violating the rule, and then it's shame on the regulators for creating the kind of environment in which the test is not taken seriously, and then a mistake to think the U.S. regulators, we'll soon see, did the other way. One other thought I had was, I wouldn't just stop at what did they know and when did they know it and who did they order, the original violation, the original design of this thing. I would really want to focus on the reaction of the company after extremely credible, serious researchers from West Virginia pointed out the problem. Because to have the company go on record utterly trying to discredit them, to say there is nothing here, if you're the CEO, why wouldn't you say, wait a minute, folks, is there some, what are they doing here? And that, to me, is reminiscent of the Flint water crisis, where when you've got researchers saying independently, there's something going on here, that's another moment.
Well, just to throw another wrench in the mix here, so it turns out that this study by West Virginia University was 2014. There is evidence from the internal VW investigation. So after this finally broke, VW launched its own investigation that in 2011, one of their own researchers reported that the way they were using this test mode was illegal. And from the best knowledge out there, that was ignored. And number two, so the place that this software hack actually gets implemented is something called the engine control unit, which is manufactured by Bosch. Now, interestingly enough, when I did the Google search, what was Bosch's role in this, that exact headline hit. But it turns out that in 2007, Bosch actually notified VW that, in fact, the way they were planning to use the test mode in the ECU, and the test mode is exactly this defeat device, was illegal. So it seems like they did know it. Anyone want to comment on that?
Only to say that there's, so I don't want to be in the position of defending VW, but I would explain that there are 600,000 employees, right? And that if you ever have looked at the calls that come in on a hotline, there are many, many, many calls if you have 600,000 employees. So what it is to know is a question in an organization like this. In a good organization with a good hotline, you would pick these things up, you would investigate them. And there is reason to believe that VW's hotline was not what you would call a good hotline. And there were only two, as I understand it, outside lawyers for 600,000 employees to receive calls. There was a compliance program inside, and so people could also report inside. And there are, in an organization like this, you're going to have hundreds of people calling all the time. So there are a lot of calls coming in. Nonetheless, another step that was taken after the events broke is that a person whose responsibility is corporate integrity and legal affairs was added to the management board, which had not been the case before. So we do see that these issues are starting to come in at a higher level. So there's, coming back to your question, did they know? We don't know who knew. Somebody knew, but yeah.
Let me comment a little bit on that one. I think they know it's not because the several employees just sort of get on the hotline and tell them. It's because they were actually engaging in a major program to reduce NOx. The technology they use is that they want to have the Linux trap technology. Just trap the NOx and then regenerate the trap. Except that thing doesn't really work well because it needs a very low sulfur fuel. And only way to get low sulfur fuel is that they get a sulfur trap in front of that. And so what happened is that the whole thing doesn't work and they have to drop the program. It's a pretty big program. So the upper management must know something that program doesn't work. And it is not clear how they can remedy, saying that all of a sudden some magic works, another device or whatever. So the management should know because of that one, not because somebody report a small thing. I agree with you, 600,000 employees, everybody dialing up the management would be unmanageable.
It just makes me think you were mentioning Bosch, and of course they make consumer products, they make dishwashers and washing machines, and of course what product these days doesn't have a mode with like a little leaf on the button that's like eco mode? And like each time you do a load of laundry, you're like, do I care about the environment? I assume if I don't press it, the laundry will get cleaner faster? I don't know. Otherwise, why not leave it on all the time? And I would be really interested if we were to create kind of like a tax amnesty window that happens every so often. If we created an eco-sham amnesty window and gave corporations the world over a moment to just step forward if when you press that button, the only thing it does is light a green LED next to the picture of the leaf. I would just be curious how many would step forward, at risk, of course, if they don't, that if they're caught for existing devices out there with that kind of functionality, that they'll pay the price I hope VW will.
Two little things. One is on the actual fine. There's 2 fines under EPA, as I understand it. There's the direct defeat device fine, which is $3,000 or so. But then there's a fine for the certificate of compliance, and that's 10x, so that's $37,000.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It does
That's how
sound
it
like
adds up to a weird
yeah,
number.
that's right.
Yeah.
Secondly, just to give you a sense of how hard this is, even when nobody's cheating, to actually do this regulation in a sensible way. One of the ways that we manage NOx, not that way, but another way, involves having urea, which some of you may have heard of as blue fluid, which gets added especially in European trucks, but also now some in the U.S. market. And that urea does effectively reduce NOx, but the urea also leaks out. And one of my collaborators, the leader of this study, Steve Barrett, has pretty nice modeling evidence now that suggests that the health impacts of the urea adding to PM are worse than the benefits. So the regulators may, in a sense, have made a mistake here, and it shows you how hard it is to get it right, to manage the overall load of this particulate matter. Because remember, the thing that's coming out of the tailpipe aren't the particulates that hurt you. It's something that combines with other stuff in the air, sulfur among others, and makes particulates that then does hurt you.
So one last question before we open it up to all of you, so you should be prepping your questions now. What do we do to avoid having this same incident N years from now with, fill in your least favorite car company next? How do we prevent this in the future?
We have to be able to do on-road monitoring. And that's a real challenge for developing combinations. I think it's one of these things where what we need is some combination of clever software and sheepish hardware. So you can, at very high cost, develop hardware that will do very accurate on-road measurements. People have done it, but you can't spread it to enough places. I think the challenge is to use a kind of clever big data approach where you use relatively cheap sensors that can monitor the emissions from tailpipes of individual cars in action, and then find a way to produce high accuracy averages. And I think that's a real challenge because as cars, well, that's what we need to do, and it's very hard to do.
And can I just ask to be sure, is your suggestion how we would gather better data to know what the right regulations are, like by your last point, or is it just how do we know if they're lying to us?
There's both things. There's
Okay.
the larger set of epidemiology and atmospheric science, air quality, to understand what the regulations should be. I mean, of course, you still have an optimal regulation question of how you trade off different things you care about. There's no right answer to how much PM we should have. But separately, we need to know how vehicles are performing in the wild, partly to avoid cheating, but also because, in fact, the makers may not know how they're performing in the wild exactly. And in the end, what we care about is how they're performing in the wild.
Well, actually, on the road sort of measurement, there was a program actually in California. It was for hydrocarbon. And what they do is that they actually shoot a laser through the essentially through the tailpipe exhaust as the car drives by, and try to look at the emissions and things like that. So I'm not going to talk about details, but I just want to look at some of the different approaches. One is sort of enforce a better inspection program. That's what you're looking at, right?
Well, I'm talking about on-road
inspection,
yeah.
all right. That's sort of, you can see the better inspection program in the real world, real use situation. That's a little bit difficult because what happens is that then you have to calibrate the thing due to the drive condition. So it's not as easy as you might think it is. So, but maybe that can be done. So that's sort of one means. The other way to do is sort of like the enforcement, that just like this case, actually the company should know by now that the longer you did not get caught, the more you have to pay. That really is a game, and I think they should realize that by now, Actually, there are cases of cheating before, but they were caught pretty soon, so they did not pay that much a penalty. Say, for example, Honda paid $25 million. So that, I forgot 25 or 250. That's still a small amount of money, sort of in this kind of scheme. Not like the billions that Volkswagen is facing with. So, well, maybe this case is a good case that force the management to know that they should not do that. If I were in the management, the first thing you do is that if you cheat, you'll always get caught. And the later you get caught, the worse it is. So this may be a good example, but a really hefty penalty was trying to sort of deter the cheating. And then the third one, which I think is the most important, is really to develop the culture within the engineering organization to see what is right. So that may not be as easy because sometimes what is right is not obvious.
Mario, you were asking what happens next, and of course latent within your question is what happens now, in the sense that normally once you've caught the crime, you stop the crime by simply arresting the crime in progress, by arresting the person. Here we've still got all of these cars puffing around out there, and I had originally thought that you could simply say, state by state, you'll flunk inspection when your inspection next comes up, unless you've taken it to the shop in the meantime and had the firmware patch that makes it not cheat anymore. But I have heard at least some rumor, and I'm curious to hear from those in the know, that the car may be unpatchable, that there's nothing you can do to actually have it. It's not just like it'll be less sporty, it's like there's actually no way to make it pass the test the way the physical engine is configured. And that could put us to the bizarre spectacle of maybe having to junk, 500,000 cars or send them all to somewhere else where they're allowed to be, which doesn't really help global pollution very much. And I guess that, to me, as much as I was kind of on the high horse in my opening talk, I'm not sure I would want to go that far. It just seems like such an awful waste to take all these cars and trash them. It might mean we have to live with it until they retire on their own accord and just have the punishment be the fines and such. And maybe, I don't know if there's NOx offsets the way there are carbon offsets, but maybe there's some kind of offset you could try to purchase, or future VW cars have to be even more until it averages out pollution friendly. And I don't know the answer though, can the cars be fixed?
I think that's why.
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to, I had the same question. Can the cars be fixed? Because I've heard there has been no fix. But coming back to Margot's other question about preventing these things going forward, I don't disagree with any of the legal solutions and the penalties and so on. But fundamentally, I don't see how we can avoid these things in the future unless we have the kinds of leaders who want to take care of the environment and who want to take care of people. And that comes back to corporate governance, I think. And who are the people who are leading companies around the world, and how are they chosen, and what are their competencies, and what are their values? And because no matter what laws and complicated systems you put in place, if people think the game is to try to beat the system, then it will just be forever this kind of cat and mouse race. And I think it will be to some extent, but there has to be some cadre of people who will actually show us the way to do things better. So in a sense, I feel it all comes back to leadership at some point.
Two comments. On the answer to Jonathan's question, I don't know. My guess is just a guess, is that it may be or may not be that you can't bring it precisely into compliance, but I'm pretty confident that by patching engine control stuff, you could make it a lot better. But I don't know. I'm not an expert, but I've read in just sort of New York Times articles and friends who do automotive work that VW may have had a particular culture. So the issue wasn't just a leader. It was that VW is the senior leadership, engineering and business leadership, are in a town that's a completely all-auto town, much more so than the heads of some other major automakers. And the town has traditionally seen environmental regulators as bad. And there's been a strong sense in VW corporate-wide that they were fighting against overzealous environmental regulators. And maybe all car manufacturers have had that a little bit, but I think there's at least some reason to believe that VW had that to larger measure. And some of that may have to do with the odd corporate structure of it and the location of the town and other things, but that's speculation.
Yeah, just to add to that, there are a lot of unusual features about VW from the shareholder point of view, the ownership structure, and so on. So what I've observed is that whatever your area of expertise, you bring it to this, and it's sort of a Rorschach test for whatever reforms need to be made for in your area.
Yeah.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. I will repeat questions so that they end up on the stream. So we're going to go one. Pardon? Or I could walk the microphone up. Okay. We'll do that. That'll give you a little more exercise. All right. Start over on this side.
I want to thank all of you guys for being here. It's a fascinating discussion. I wanted to start with, I guess, Professor Zatrain's remarks. And it seems to me that this sort of advocacy of crackdown sounds an awful lot like the war on drugs, right? So, like, you're caught with 25 grams of marijuana, and we need to crack down and enforce the rule of law and put these drug dealers behind bars, et cetera. And I think that's reasonable, but prohibition failed, right? And how do we tax alcohol today? It is sort of based on content, and it's paid more by the consumers than by the alcohol companies. So let me give you an actual data proposal here. And what happens now that we have big data and sensors? So take, for instance, the idea that you can not just monitor the tailpipes, but we could be gathering all of the sensors from the car data, and somebody can build a model so that if it's 27 degrees outside and it's raining and you're going up a hill, I mean, the cars are pretty, there's pretty reliable data. So you can imagine after a couple of years, you could have good correlates for every individual model to what they're actually producing at the tailpipe in terms of pollutants, right? And you could instrument a small number of cars to get very precise measurements. And then how about take the particular pollutants, CO2, nitrous, or whatever, and just once you know what each car is probably producing, just tax it, right? So you can then reward the hypermilers who are driving certain things, and now you're not making a regulation based on technology, which we know these things can often be manipulated, right? So if you want to drive a Ferrari and pollute, you just pay for it. And then you could imagine, for instance, a nonpartisan commission where people have representative industry, academia, or whatever, and all you do is you set the prices. So if you decide that urea is worse than nitrous, you just jack up the price for what it costs you, and now, it's a tax or it's a road usage thing. You could now integrate it, for instance, with access privileges for like hybrids in HOV lanes and that type of thing. And you can imagine that you could work out a neutral solution or something that gets reassessed by technical experts that would actually overall lead to harm reduction and may not necessarily put criminality back into it, but you could actually then solve the problem with a more technological solution. Sorry for the long question, but what do you think?
First, can I congratulate you on the highest signal-to-noise question I think I've ever received. Extremely efficient and well-considered. I don't think I can recall having also had as much of an agreement-disagreement whiplash as I had with your question. Actually, I mean a disagreement-disagreement whiplash. So the first part of your question was, isn't this just like the war on drugs, and look how that's turning out? I don't think we're at risk of like tens of thousands of corporate CEOs languishing in prisons for having just gone a tiny bit over a regulation because they're just addicted to violating regulations. It just doesn't seem like a great mapping to me. And so for one thing, I think they can certainly serve their time in a club fed. So it's like it can be gentle. The second thing is, it's exactly not the war on drugs, because this isn't about trying to govern individual behavior and to stop a market that will find its level wherever you put a block, it'll go around, when it's about growing something somewhere and basically moving it in small quantities to somebody who desperately wants it. This is not the story of an Audi. Right? There's just not like, oh, they're just going to have knockoff Audis coming from like who knows where, and we'll sneak Audis on Audi mules that will come in. And it's like, do you have any Audis on you? So like to me, this has absolutely no relationship with the drug war, and in fact is the opposite. These are easy to regulate, easy to target companies that at least will say they aspire to listening to the law, and you just need to help them do it. So that was the part I disagreed with, if that wasn't clear. The second part was sort of the big data part of the question, which was, why not festoon automobiles, or some every 10th one can be like the Nielsen automobile that will report what's going on inside the car and external things, and nicely help not just the company tune the car through some form of jiggering the algorithm, but rather help the driver tune the car. As some cars, as you point out with hypermiling, there are people who do that, and they really like the little display that tells them every time they press the gas, you know, another angel loses its wings in a puff of nitrous oxide, nitrogen oxide. Nitrous oxide would be a laughing angel. So like, I like that idea, modulo the idea that the data should be sufficiently anonymized that we don't get into random privacy violations. So that seems like a great idea to me, and a way of spreading the responsibility for minimizing pollution. Then your third idea was kind of this cap and trade notion that says just turn it into a market. And I guess I'm not innately against it, although there are some wrongs that we don't want to cap and trade. It's not like, look, if you're willing to pay the price, you can murder someone. And it's just, how much is it worth to you? And some people will meet the price. You know, like, obviously, this is not what you were saying. So there is a question about this, and to the extent that it's straws on camels, anybody who likes cap and trade, especially because the regulator gets to set the cap. So just set the cap where you think the acceptable level is, and that strikes me potentially as a good solution. Just understanding that I don't know if we want people to be able to buy their way into more pollution. There may be some Ferraris that belch enough smoke, maybe not, but there might be, that there shouldn't be amount of money you can pay to poison our children. And that's a very dramatic way of saying it. And I don't know, it's an empirical question about the difference between a Ferrari and, name your good car, a Volt. So I'm open to your third point.
I guess to clarify, I'm saying it's more like the individual paying a carbon tax.
Yeah, yeah.
The thing is, if you drive your Prius to the Gulf Stream and then you take off for Davos, you know, and I'm just saying that is that Ferrari going to be worse?
Understood.
That's all I'm saying.
Understood.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
And of course, one answer is we do have we have pricing for nitrogen oxides and for sulfur in the U.S., and in some respects it works pretty efficiently. And I think there is something for sure to what you're saying, that with a big data approach, if we could really get the data, I'll come to that in 1 second, you could actually be much more efficient as a regulator, in the sense that you wouldn't regulate cars all the same at different locations and times of day and year, because in fact there are optimal ways to do that to get the most health benefit at a reasonable cost. So there'd be room for a lot of optimizing. I think it's not as easy as you might think to imagine we could just get this data. One reason is every driver has an incentive to cheat. Because if you really have local control of your vehicle, you'd rather drive faster and use less gasoline and emit more NOx. That's your incentive to do that. And so just doing every 10th vehicle and having an averaging isn't going to do it, I think. Finally, one comment on the question of whether or not rich people should get to drive their Ferraris. I think one obvious thing to do, which is now done in quite a lot of countries, would be to think about it the way speeding fines are and other fines that are meant to dissuade a socially bad but not a hideous thing, but dissuade it in a way that doesn't just allow rich people to buy their way out, which is to make the fine a fraction of income. So in lots of countries now, speeding fines are a fraction of income, with the idea that you want to have the utility disbenefit to speeding be about the same to everybody, so log income.
Huh. So if like,
Go ahead.
So
No.
you may have seen there are speeding fines that have been paid now that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for individual speeding fines, and that's because the person speeding was rich.
Oh, by the way,
it's funny what it would do to the incentives of where to set your speed traps.
Well, that guy actually left the country. So I just want to make 2 points. One is that the cap and trade is already existing. They do trade through economy between the companies. You can buy if you don't satisfy the CAFE requirement, you can buy the credit from another company.
But could VW have paid ahead of time to just have the cars pollute as much as they do?
No, that's not
right,
their
that's
objective.
Cafe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, if you want to see big data and do all that, there's just too many cars. I mean, the system is just too big. And so I don't think it's really practical.
Well, it's not.
Computers can keep track of all the cars. The issue is the actual sensors to make accurate measurements of the different gases, and especially particulates. Those sensors right now cost more than a vehicle. So it's not, we're not at a world, yeah.
Well, okay.
But it
So, yeah, I would actually like to bring in a different perspective because I actually own one of these evil cars. And
it owns you.
Yeah, well, that too maybe. But one thing that I thought was interesting was actually there were reports that Volkswagen, the EPA rather, is actually trying to compel Volkswagen to produce more electric cars in America. So that was something that one of the panelists brought up in terms of, well, let's produce an even more efficient car. But I would just like to hear the panel at large's sort of perspective on, as someone who does own one of these cars and it does affect in a way that's sort of more than a nice, fun academic exercise. Is there any advice? Where do we go from here? What to do? This, that, whatever. But yeah, thanks.
Just to be clear, if you own an old car, you own an evil car in this sense. So the regulations have got so much tighter that if you own a 20-year-old car, it's way worse than these modern Volkswagens.
I think the specific advice is, I think at some point VW sent you like a debit card. Like, here's some money, enjoy. Yeah, and drinks on you. I was wondering if like somehow it was like click wrap, like using this car means you will never sue us. Thanks very much, bye. And I think it turns out that's not the case. They just like, as part of their panicked PR mode, they're like, let's just give all our drivers some money. Yeah. And I think they gave you a check and a debit card, right?
Yeah, it's they gave $500, that's just $500, and then another $500, that's $500 at the dealer. So we
Yes.
need an oil change.
VW accessories.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Right, and the T-shirts and whatever.
Bumper sticker. Yes, it's one of those cars. Yeah. So enjoy. And then wait to see. I assume at some point you will be summoned back to the VW dealer to get the car patched.
Yeah.
But I think I wasn't making my point. I was being too complicated. There's no question that VW did something really ugly by deliberately cheating. But it's important to say that if we wake up tomorrow and said, what cars would we target to try and get off the road or repair to cost effectively make our air cleaner, it wouldn't be those vehicles. It would be old vehicles.
It's interesting that maybe it means VW should be compelled to do a buyback program, not of the cars in question, but of just old beaters.
Exactly. And this, remember, these buyback programs, this is real. So in LA, a significant fraction of the non-compliance that made it hard for LA to meet air quality were old vehicles, and buybacks were cost effective.
And if, as part of that deal, the cars were not required to be patched that are on the road right now that are in violation, then the current drivers have nothing to complain about. Yep. They're actually perfectly happy, and the resale value of the car should stabilize. Yep. All right, we've solved this thing.
Yeah, but that's sort of run against the popular.
We had it solved for 5 seconds.
Right, the popular demand of punishment.
Yeah. I don't know about that though, because if the ultimate thing,
For the good of everything.
if it's to save the environment, if there's a certain number of beaters bought back that would save the environment, maybe that's the way to go.
I'm sold. I think you solved it. It's like a Cypre Award. What interests me in this case and in general is the displacement we're seeing. That the crime was committed 6 years before it was discovered. We can easily imagine it being a different CEO, different engineers. The crime was committed in a country that was different than where it was discovered. And it seems to be going forward, when we have these algorithms doing these things that may or may not be illegal, that it may be very difficult to find and punish those responsible because they might not be around anymore, because they might not be even known. We might even know who wrote that code. Let's say it was a rogue programmer the next time, or which manager approved it because there was never anything in writing. I think that really adds an interesting wrinkle to what I think is a really good idea about punitive damages to make this not happen?
I guess that's aimed at me since I was Mr. Punitive Damages. I think Bruce raises an interesting point, and I think it's my going on a big toot about we should be thinking of this in a criminal mode maybe does have to do with finding real wrongdoing by real people. You can't really put corporations in jail, although you can assess them fines over and above the actual harm they do. So on the first part, on actually holding people responsible, surely we can only hold responsible the people that have some culpability. And there's culpability in addition to directly having done the act. It's if you were criminally negligent about it, perhaps there's something. But I agree that's starting to get to the periphery of what we punish when we punish. So I'm less worried about really coming down hard on a company where the wrongdoing might have been by engineers who have long since departed. There are so many benefits of the corporate form, of the idea of having like McDonald's then, McDonald's now, McDonald's forever. Like, okay, well that means that if something went wrong at McDonald's, X years ago and it bears on injury today that couldn't have been discovered earlier, McDonald's pays. And if it was egregious behavior by McDonald's, the corporate entity, it pays more. And I think that's okay. That's part of the idea of the corporate form, and that's why they aren't exactly people. You can't treat them like that. But you can say that they bear continuity with who they were, just like if you have toxic waste or something that was, oh, well, that was 3 presidents ago. That was when we were in the toxic waste industry, not in the ice cream cone industry that we're in now. You still pay.
Let me just add that this is nothing new. The case that I mentioned in my remarks about Johns Manville and the asbestos liability, the decision makers made those decisions in the 1930s. And the long latency period meant that a lot of the illness wasn't manifested until 20, 30 years later. So it was very interesting to go back and look at the decision making at the time in the 1930s. And I think all of us, in fact, I would say that this was one of the reasons that I got very interested in this question of the decision making, because there were absolutely people who said, look, we're going to keep exposing people. We know that it's harmful, and we're not going to tell them because they'll quit working. So, but this is nothing new. It is part of what the corporate forum is all about.
Exxon and climate.
So I'm wondering if there's sort of an aspect of economic nationalism here. I wonder if because it was VW and because it was American regulation, they paid less attention. I certainly find it pretty easy to imagine American companies making decisions about their operations in Europe, where they might kind of poo-poo data regulations or GMO regulations. So I'm wondering if that's part of the ethical problem.
I don't know, but part of what I was hinting at, but I don't know much about, is that the Europeans collectively, regulators and industry, had made decisions, as you were saying, around high-performance diesels. And those are actually decisions that are killing lots of Europeans, but they were made collectively, and there was a lot of weight behind them. And in a sense, I could easily imagine people at VW thinking the North Americans have their particular obsession about super low NOx. They're silly North Americans. We're pretty good Europeans. We want to keep going. And that would be a collective thing, not just a VW thing. That's a guess.
I think the simple story, the uncomplicated story, is supposed to be when you engage in commerce with people in a given legal jurisdiction, then the authorities in that jurisdiction get to tell you about how to shape your products. And there are ways in which many of us who study internet freedom and believe in it, we worry a lot about the convoy only going as slow as the slowest ship, especially if what you're selling are bits rather than physical objects. And so we like to see not that somebody pushing information out to the world has to figure out through a compliance office how to shape it to 27 or 65 or 200 different jurisdictions. I guess when it comes to kinetic stuff like cars or cigarettes, it makes it harder to be like, cry me a river. You have different labeling regulations in Australia where it's like you have to put a dirty lung on the cigarette package, and in the United States where it's like, please don't buy this. Like, just do what you need to do. But again, that's the simple story. It's a constant push and pull, as we see with tax compliance as well, that you can make a joint venture in a given country and run it from afar, and then if that country has a problem with it, it turns out the bank account is mostly empty of the joint venture or of the local subsidiary, and you can't maybe get back to the other. Having a decent regime, especially among countries that embrace the rule of law, for the civil enforcement of judgments and for understanding that there are times to pierce a corporate veil or something, is a way of vindicating the idea. The Europeans would call it subsidiarity, but the people most likely to look out for their people are the governments of those people in particular, and they ought to be empowered to say, for much commerce, this is what's going to be acceptable. And I say that again, knowing that here we have France going after Google for the right to be forgotten, and that's an entirely different conversation that I'll just leave right there.
So just to pick up on that for a second, there's a continuum. The cigarette package labeling is presumably really cheap to change the labeling, so as you said, cry me river, we do it. But for aircraft and engines, there are really only a couple, three, manufacturers of large-scale aircraft engines, and two big duopoly, obviously, the big airframers. And it's a global market, and so in fact,
Yes.
you really can't have local regulations.
Or if you do, the convoy will move only as slow as the slowest ship, which may or may not be a good thing. The fact that California, before the feds were interested, managed to govern so much in emissions, isn't it California that was setting certain standards? That then
California still has the authority to set standards, and in many ways, California has led the U.S. and the U.S. has led the world for automotive.
But not just led the U.S. by example. It's
No.
well, hell, if we're going to have to make it good for California, now we'll just give the Iowans a California car.
Yeah.
And it's what Texas does for textbooks, too. So it's pick your poison.
Hi, I've got the microphone. So I just had 2 points. So I, too, am the owner of one of those polluting cars. And I feel like you're all kind of minimizing the kind of ethical crime that was committed against the purchasers of these cars, who, take myself, I compost my things, I ride my bicycle to work. I bought this car because it had high mileage and it met theoretically, met the clean air standards. And there are a lot of, from people I've spoken to, I'm not the only person who feels that way. And it feels to me like the compensation should be directed at that issue as well, and that those owners of the cars ought to be compensated by the company significantly. In other words, take this car back and pay me for what I paid for it, because you sold it to me under false pretenses. It was not a legitimate sale in the first place. Take it back, give me the money back. That was one point. I got another point to make.
Well, if I may, just on the first one, there's obviously a lot of innate power to that point. It's fraud. And I mean, we're speaking in a jurisdiction where, a guy had a car sold to him where they had cleaned up a paint job issue as it crossed on the barge to be sold as a new car, BMW versus Gore, and got huge punitive damages against BMW that the Supreme Court had to pare back a little bit just for lying to him about the condition of the paint on the car. Now, if you're thinking that consumer protection means that, surely it should mean this. But just the thing I want to maybe push you on a little bit is what David was talking about, which is the injury, the actual injury, the physical, tangible injury is not to you, it's to everyone. It's not specific to you like poisoned water.
64 people were killed over the time that these cars were...
Right, but they're not the drivers particularly. It's like all of us are. Well, right, there's that. There's maybe having to be the...
Sign up for that when I bought the car.
I get that. I get that. But then if your worry is that you are being the instrument of marginal destruction, sounds like the name of a very bad album, doesn't it? We're on the eve of marginal destruction. But if that's your worry, then the remedy we were cooking up should exactly appeal to your composting soul. Because it's saying that thanks to this glitch, this wrong done by VW, the remedy is going to result in that much more
I think
terrible
that's
stuff
reasonable.
taken
And
off.
in fact, if folks are going to take that extra money and build bicycle lanes or take
Exactly.
old cars off the road,
And then you
that
can
would be
drive your
sufficient.
car with pride, knowing.
No, they should still take the car back, but they should also pay that penalty.
Well, that's
So my second point was about the, as was mentioned several times, they did maybe an economic analysis happened here. The fines were never that large before. Why shouldn't this be criminalized? Why wouldn't that be the mechanism that would prevent this from happening again in the future?
Do you want to pick up on the question of criminalization for Sarbanes-Oxley?
I just to say quickly, I'm open to that if we can find the actual people who did it. I just was not wanting to criminalize people who didn't do it.
No, I wanted to come back a little bit to your first point, because I think that's a very, very important aspect of this case, is all of the derivative fraud that grew out of it, from applying for the certifications to the treatment of the shareholders to the various consumers. There are so many false statements made as a result of all of this. And if fundamentally we get to the point where we can't believe anything that's written on any product, then we can't solve any of these problems. So this underlying question of truthful communication, I think, is very, very fundamental here. Now, as for criminalization, I understand the logic of it, but at the moment you suggest that, I think of all of the different kinds of information that are going up and down the chain in a company every single day, and how a CEO or a board at the top of this can certify that everything that's coming up that chain is true. I think it's impossible.
And so are you
actually.
skeptical of SOX, of Sarbanes-Oxley?
No, I'm not, but I'm skeptical of adding on for every single issue that we get, I'm going to certify that that's, so it's really, where does this all lead? That brings me back to this question. If we don't have people who actually tell the truth, fundamentally, because they think it's important, we'll never be able to function effectively if we have to have this apparatus in place.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The other point of view is that what good does it do to bankrupt Volkswagen? There are a lot of people who make a living out of that. I mean, German employment and all that stuff. So you really have to consider what's an appropriate punishment, what good does it do, really, it boils down to that.
Or let them pay on the installment plan?
I think there really is. I think there is something, I'm not an expert on corporate governance, to have an ability to criminalize, but I see the problem that there's an enormous flow of information, enormous complexity of little regulations. I helped run a little startup, and I see that even in our 20-person thing. And I feel like we need some way that it would be very hard to come up with that criminalizes proportionally to scale. So the point is, if it was some minutia of the regulation, like the mattress label, it's one thing. In this case, one of the couple of things we regulate seriously about cars are some basic safety and emissions features. And this wasn't one vehicle or one model year. It was some main part of the car, of the total product line across the world of the company. And it was one of the main set of regulations that has to deal with they deliberately broke. So I feel like that somehow rises to a bigger threshold than just, did they get this tax form right? But how you would actually make that into useful law, I don't know.
All right, maybe we have time for one or two more questions. Anyone still with a burning question? I have one. Going, two. Okay, so we'll take those two, and then we'll wrap it up.
I don't know if this is a burning question, but I'm curious. Volkswagen can't be the only company that thought about cheating on their software when the car is in the bay. Is there any evidence that other companies have done the same thing, or is anybody looking into that? And a second point that I just want to make, not to defend Volkswagen, but I wonder a little bit if all of us do this same kind of thing all the time, and they just did it a bit more egregiously and got caught. Because how many of us, when we know that there's an inspection coming, or a site visit or something like that, kind of clean up things a little bit?
Just tell me which restaurant you own?
Yeah. And, you know, just so there won't be some trouble. Now, I understand that there are lines were drawn, and whatever Volkswagen did seems to be on the other side of the line. But I don't think that they're unique. I think that part of that is just human nature, and it happens.
Do you want to?
Well, there are actually many cases before that they cheat. I mentioned the case of Honda, and then there were the truck engine companies who cheated on the emission stuff, and they cheat by the same manner. I mean, they have a big diesel engine, and they actually cheated on the software to detect the emission cycle test, and that was found out. And so I forgot how much they paid, 25 million pieces or something like that. You can find that out on the web. Okay, so that's one. And then the other question is that, what was the other question?
Don't we all? Doesn't everybody? Before an inspection?
Oh, okay, yeah. But this is a case which is completely different. Is that you try to you are not trying to clean up a little bit. It's putting sort of basically present another gadget for inspection, not the original gadget. So this is more than your regular sort of trying to tidy things up when the inspection time comes.
Inspectors are coming, we should buy the refrigerator now.
No. The inspectors are coming. We'll show them the fake restaurant.
Just to pick up on what are the competitors doing, I think there are investigations ongoing right now of other car companies, particularly in Europe. But I was sort of struck that there were no companies that came forward and said, you can trust us. It seemed like a great marketing campaign, and nobody came up with it, so I don't know.
I think it's a good idea not to be Inspector Javert. Like, you do want a sense of proportion, and even rules, rather than standards, are meant to breathe at times. On the other hand, the kind of breathing we expect when the law is applied to individuals in their flawed humanity, we frankly expect and should expect more of the corporate form. Like, you shouldn't be like McDonald's threw a temper tantrum and just like decided to, whatever. I'm trying to think of some terrible thing McDonald's. The company sent out a memo in a just really angry moment ordering that spit be put on all the French fries. Like, that's, really? So I think, again, there's like a huge give and take, and it's quite possible that the invention of the corporate form is one of the like grandest, certainly the most powerful inventions humanity has come up with. And we do a lot to be solicitous towards it because of the blessings it bestows to ourselves and our posterity. But then there are times, I think, not to be just like, companies will be companies, what are you going to do? The way that you might with kids or with adults even, and why you don't want a police officer on every single corner and every time somebody runs a yellow light a little late that, somehow they should immediately be in trouble. So I think there is a difference there, even as I concede on that scale of 1 to 10. I'm not prepared to say this is innately a 10 myself, but it's the point of the dagger, and I worry about the rest of what's behind it if we don't deal now.
So my question is about sort of ways that we can improve the testing going forward. There's been this idea about big data, and there's sort of an inherent problem I have in my mind that for that to work, you sort of have to get thousands of cars in the market, and then you have all this data. So what happens if you have all these thousands of cars and the data comes back and it's like, oh crap, this isn't good. Now you've got all these thousands of cars. So ideally, you would be able to pass a test before you start selling cars, right? Like, okay, this car is checked the box, now you're able to sell it. So there's sort of a chicken-egg issue on top of the fact that it may not be economically feasible to put all the sensors in. So there's an alternative idea of, is there a better way to just run a standardized test similar to the way we're doing it, but just be more sophisticated about it? I mean, if all the companies, if we know how they're gaming it, can we just rig it better and just keep this cat and mouse game going in a better way so that, we have, and one way you could see that as we have actually more control there, because if we know the ways that you could cheat, we can start cutting those off. It's just sort of a pushback against the big data approach. It may be it may have more problems than the way we do it now.
Oh, I'm sure by now they have ways of the EPA and everything, so they have ways to detect these things. So I don't think that that's going to be a problem. I think it can still be standardized tests, but it's a different standard, so that they can actually look at sort of different transit cycle, and they can basically buy or rent a car on the street and then just test it out randomly. It's impossible to test out every car because it's quite a bit of resources required to test one car. So right now it's just sort of like they randomly pick a car and test it.
It's a hard problem because the regulation around a standardized drive cycle is very much a rigid pass-fail regulation. So if the car you're selling makes that, but then I randomly buy one off the street and test and it doesn't quite make it, the problem is my test isn't standardized. So it's hard for me, the regulator, to say that you're definitely cheating. Maybe you're not. So I think this is actually a tough problem, not easy to do. I think a screening process where we do more of what West Virginia was doing and do more on-road tests of specific vehicles is something we ought to do, and the Europeans were really lax in not doing it. And that would catch more of this egregious stuff, but it's inherently a hard problem because if you want a sharp cutoff, you've got to have a well-defined test. If you have a well-defined test, then it's easy for an algo to know it's undergoing the test.
Lynn, did you have thoughts?
No thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think this is where it's really important to distinguish between, are we trying to detect intentional gaming of a test, or are we trying to minimize the amount of pollution together that even a good company would want to do? And I would not, of course, nor would anyone want to see a company put something out in good faith that's meeting the standards as they apply, and then thanks to the data that comes in, find that it's much worse than anybody thought. It seems weird to be like, well, we wouldn't want to know that, because that's just like ad disasterum. It would be, if we do know that, then all right, let's figure out, is there a firmware update we can do that'll adjust for these real-world conditions in this particular place, like high altitude or something. And it wouldn't be somehow punishing them as if they had gamed the test if it turns out that it's flunking our standards or not doing what we want in real-world conditions. I think we should want to know that and just be judicious about what we do with the information when we learn it. On the cat and mouse game, I would just point out there are so many ways to understand the bad behavior or to elicit or discover the bad behavior of the mouse, and that's where to be able to have good whistleblower protections, to set up incentives, and it's the kind of thing we were going back and forth about, is a Sarbanes-Oxley-like approach a good idea? Because if you make it about everything, suddenly a CEO is paralyzed. But figuring out whether something like that aligns the incentives of the corporations so that doing the ethical thing is also the right thing for them can be quite good. But I also totally credit Lynn's point that thinking that you'll solve a problem by just like ubiquitous surveillance. If there's a lesson from like other areas of internet study, it's like, no. We want people, and ideally corporations, which at the end of the day are run by people, to have their own compasses tuned in a certain way. And if you don't have enough people with good compasses, there may be not a whole lot at the end of the day that law can do to protect against that. So having that sense of individual responsibility about the car you drive, the company you run, the engineering team you're a part of, that does strike me as the like first atomic element in a good molecule towards a healthy society. And the rest of this stuff is just dealing with the inevitable outliers. And you got to deal with those, but you want that to be outliers against a very healthy and self-reflective middle zone.
I would just add to that, there's a dimension of this that I think a lot about that really hasn't come up in this discussion, and that is the role of innovation in our society and what companies contribute to innovation. And every time we have some kind of misconduct or wrongdoing, and we bring out all the apparatus for catching people and punishing them and so on, we're narrowing, in a way, the capacity or the scope for innovation. And so at some societal level, there's a trade-off here between how much we want to control and how much we want to give people just free and companies leeway to invest, to innovate, because I think there's a chilling effect. It's more of a chilling effect on people's willingness to be creative, to invest, to try new things. And it's very indirect, and so it's hard to decide where is the right line there. But I think it's something that's worth keeping in mind. It's another negative side effect of direct surveillance all the time, that we may pay a price in terms of our capacity to innovate.
And on that note, why don't we thank our panel?